a long ways from the terrible battlefields up in northern Virginia and from the burned-out towns of Atlanta and Savannah and Charleston, a feller might think that the war between the states pretty much passed rural Randolph County by. Oh, but it was here, and a drive through downtown Asheboro to look at the street names is all it takes to prove it. They bear the names of the big Quaker families, the military leaders, merchants, wagon makers, and other community leaders of that very time. You'll hear some of them names a little later and see what I mean. These recent pictures show where old Asheboro was originally started, centered at the intersection of Main and Salisbury Streets. Now, keep in mind that the Asheboro of 1860 was a small village of about 160 souls. This is an illustration of what it probably looked like based on a description somebody wrote at the time. It was a trading center for the gold mines in the county and a toll house stop on the Plank Road. As you can imagine, Saturday was the big day in town in them days. Oh, the place would be swarming with farmers and miners and all kinds of people trading, looking for entertainment, and just visiting. The Presbyterian Church was built on Worth Street in 1850 and was the only Presbyterian church in the county until 1947. Another landmark, one that still survives to this day, is the Female Academy. It was originally built at the intersection of Salisbury and Fayetteville Streets. One of the most important citizens of Asheboro at that time was a fellow named Jonathan Worth. He had a hand in business and industry, agriculture, transportation, county and town government, legal matters, and education. He was state treasurer during the Civil War and governor from 1865 till 1868. This is a picture took around 1870 of the Worth mansion where he lived. It stood at the intersection of Worth and Main. This 1865 Coast Guard survey map shows Randolph County to be made up of several little towns built around mills, mainly grist and cotton mills. Now, although they wove fabric at all the 5 cotton mills spread up and down Deep River, the raw cotton had to be shipped in here from further south and east. You see, we didn't have the climate or the flat country for growing cotton, and that's why there weren't no big plantations or plantation economy here. The cotton mill at Cedar Falls made more cloth for shirts and underwear than any other mill in the state. Now, this was before there were many mechanical conveniences in Randolph County. All the cooking was done on the hearth in skillets or pots hanging from a bar in the chimney. They sowed wheat by hand on fresh plowed ground and brushed it in by pulling the tops of bushy trees over it with horses. Corn was planted by hand. They harvested the wheat using a scythe and cradle, and they swung the scythe in the meadows, too. All the shoes made by cobblers working with hammer and awl on shoe last. All the clothes were made from flax or wool, carded, spun, and woven on looms. Light was from candles made out of mutton tallow. Yes, sir, it was a dark time in more ways than one. When Fort Sumter got attacked in 1861 to start the war between the states, the news got here a lot slower than you might think. There weren't no radio or television, of course, and the telegraph just connected the bigger cities. News come to the countryside and small towns at the speed of a horse. Oh, but it was some news. Here's how one of the prominent women of Randolph County described it. She said, "Even though the story was a month old when it was heard, nothing ever set us back on our haunches like that. It struck us like a clap of thunder. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a uniformed officer rode through our neighborhood in a gallop, his horse in a lather, rushing up to every farmhouse door and yelling at the top of his voice, 'War! War! The country is at war! Fort Sumter's been bombarded! All able-bodied men between 18 and 35 report in 3 days for military duty,' and away he went on to the next house. I tell you," she said, "it left our neighborhood milling around. All this occurred so suddenly in our community that soldiers were being rounded up before anybody knew what the war was about. The issues of war had never been discussed. It was some months before the sayings developed, 'Preserve the Union and pickle the slaves,' or 'Preserve the slaves and pickle the Union.' And to these simple folks of a peaceful countryside, such cliches about war meant next to nothing. At the outbreak of the war, Randolph County sent 9 full companies to the Confederate Army. Company M of the 22nd Regiment carried a battle flag that was finally lost in one of the engagements. That flag was found, though, up in Connecticut in 1965 and returned to the Randolph Historical Society. The men of Companies I, L, and M fought in every battle that the Army of Northern Virginia fought except First Manassas. Walter Clark, who was later the father of John W. Clark of Franklinville and who was called from Hillsborough Military Academy at the age of 14 to drill the troops and went on to fight with the men of Randolph, said of them, quote, "It will be seen that from the very beginnings of the war to its close, wherever there were hardships to be endured, sufferings to be borne, and hard fighting to be done, the county of Randolph was represented and represented with honor in the persons of her gallant sons." Oh, there was heroism and gallantry, but you mustn't assume that what happened here was typical of the rest of the South. No, sir, because around here there were a lot of people who were pro-Union, and that fact caused a whole bunch of nasty neighbor-against-neighbor conflicts that simmered almost from the beginning of the war. The Unionists and deserters always seemed to be most active here in the Randolph County area. Not just Randolph County, mind you, but the whole center of the state, which was, and still is, North Carolina's traditional Quaker belt. But it wasn't just the Quakers who opposed the war. Several other sects with ties to Europe had their own strong pacifist, anti-slavery, and anti-secessionist beliefs. The Moravian, Lutheran, Dunkard, and German Reformed churches all added their part to the grassroots pro-Union attitude that sprung up around here. And because fewer than 9% of Randolph County citizens owned slaves, there was little vested interest in the institution of slavery. And there was the Methodist. The Wesleyan Methodist movement was an abolitionist sect that had their headquarters right in Asheboro in the 1850s. The Asheboro Methodist Church on Salisbury Street was the first church built in Asheboro. Early abolitionists like Daniel Worth and Hinton Helper held peace rallies, and Helper threatened to lynch some of the most prominent men in town. But when word of this reached the Confederate government in Raleigh, Worth and Helper had to run for their lives, and the active and open opposition to the war pretty much ended in the early 1860s. After that, the opposition went underground, and 2 other men, Brian Tyson and William Owens, took up the cause. Tyson was a writer and propagandist who worked for a peaceful resolution of the war. Owens was just the opposite. He put together a well-armed guerrilla band that fought against everything connected to the Confederacy. Tyson had a good deal of money, lived in Moore County just across the Randolph line. He became the active voice of the lower classes who didn't like the conscription laws. Tyson said, "I was urged to start an opposition movement. I never saw people in so great a state of excitement. All that was ever lacking was the stars and stripes to be planted here with enough force to defend them. The conscripts would have enlisted under the banner almost unanimously." In a book he wrote called A Ray of Light, he called the Confederacy a politically hopeless aberration whose defeat by the industrial and populous North was inevitable. He wrote emotional letters to Confederate soldiers telling them to desert and come back home and join the Unionists. And there were enough who listened, or maybe reached the same conclusions on their own, to change the balance of power around here by the end of 1862. You see, working people didn't like the conscription laws, especially the clause that allowed the rich to hire men to do their fighting for them. And the growing inflation, taxes, and the strict impressment laws hit poor people the hardest. So a whole lot of them wound up deserting the Confederate cause altogether. Oh, it was a real problem in Randolph County. By the end of 1862, the desertion rate for local troops was about 25%. That's 2 to 3 times the average for the state, and it got even higher as the war went on. The men who deserted were called outliers, and back then there were plenty of dense, hilly woods around to hide whole bands of them, sometimes as many as 100 or more. Early on, the outliers learned a trick or two from runaway slaves and would try to build a dugout or cave as close to family and friends as they dared, within walking distance if they could. That way they had a constant supply of food and information. As the war drew on, though, the economy got worse and the number of deserters grew to where most couldn't live in that kind of luxury, if that's what you can call it. After late 1862, most of the outliers had to live by themselves or in little bands under terrible conditions. It was a hard life for a lot of men. Having the outliers around made an already tense situation even worse. The pro-Confederate families and organizations treated all the Unionists, and especially the deserters, with total contempt and eventually violence. And when that happened, the deserters and Unionists reacted in kind. Secessionists against Unionists. It was a war, a little local war that was happening right around here, while the bigger war was going on all around us. Around the start of the war between the states, a secret organization formed and called itself the Heroes of America. This organization helped direct the anti-war Unionist movement all over the state. It practiced rituals learned from the book of Isaiah in the Bible and had secret meetings to come up with anti-Confederate things to do. As its emblem, they chose a scarlet cord, like the one Rehab used to lower the spies from the Jericho wall. Members of the organization would wear a red string inside their coat lapels so they could recognize each other. Red string showed up on windowsills and tree limbs along the Underground Railway to the north so members of the organization could find each other and trade information or get help. Pretty soon they started calling themselves Red Strings. There's pretty good evidence that blacks, both free and slave, worked with the militant Unionists against the Confederacy. George Clark, a free black carpenter who lived in Davidson County, was a member of the Heroes of America, or the Red String, who served as a Unionist pilot and helped guide Union General Stoneman's cavalry when it invaded western and central North Carolina in April of 1865. Toward the end of the war, a loyal Confederate from Randolph County told Governor Zeb Vance that, quote, "Our Negroes are nearly all in league with the deserters," end quote. In 1864, another loyal Confederate warned Vance that the deserters in Chatham County were going to arm the slaves. That same year, what they called a free woman of color was arrested in Montgomery County for aiding deserters. A year earlier, a Confederate soldier wrote to his sister in Randolph. He said, "More than 2/3 of those slaves around Father's are Tories. I talked very plain to them and told them I wished the last Tory was hung 60,000 feet high." Things got violent. There were skirmishes between armed bands of deserters and draft dodgers, and the Confederate troops and state militia sent in to hunt them down. That's probably why leadership of the pro-Unionists shifted from the scholarly Brian Tyson to the much more aggressive William Owens. Owens had deserted the 52nd Regiment North Carolina troops, which was a Randolph County company, to go back to the little farm he owned on the Randolph-Moore County line and take care of his wife and child. From there, he took to the field as head of a large band of armed outliers in late 1862. Their bond was a common hatred for the new, harsher conscription laws passed by the Confederacy. This band pretty much held the pro-Confederates in Randolph and Moore County at ransom. They kidnapped militiamen, Confederate agents, and some of the most prominent citizens and forced them to swear loyalty oaths to Abraham Lincoln. A Moore County deserter wrote a letter right after he got back home that says, quote, "It looks like there will be bad times in this county. Colonel W. Owens and his company are taking the secessionist prisoners and making them take the oath as Union men. They took Peter Schamberger, a militia officer, and kept him a day or two and paroled him. He won't tell anything about it at all. If he does, death is his portion. You can't get a man to say he's a secessionist here now." The outliers kept up their reign of terror against militia officers and loyal Confederate citizens by burning barns, stealing crops, plundering houses, and threatening to shoot 'em. The militia officers responded with their own reign of terror. They shot deserters and draft dodgers without giving them a chance to surrender, beat and tortured their wives and children, and plundered and destroyed homes. This was real embarrassing to Governor Vance, having to resort to force of arms against fellow North Carolinians, but he felt there was no choice but to send in troops. They swept through the area in September 1862 and again in February 1863, but neither of these expeditions bagged more than a handful of suspects. That's because the outliers, just like modern-day guerrillas, would simply fade back into the woods when the troops arrived. Sometimes they fought, though, and they could fight. A letter from one of the militia commanders says Governor Vance sent a company of infantry up there to Randolph, and they were completely wiped out. According to historian William Auman, although there was no mention of such a battle in the official records, we are left with the slight possibility that an embarrassing defeat of troops by deserters was covered up by the Vance administration sometime in the winter of '62 or January of 1863. In late April of 1863, Vance asked General D.H. Hill to help restore order. He claimed he needed regular troops because the deserter bands in Randolph County, quote, "can lick my militia in a fair fight." Governor Vance's predicament was made worse by the sad fact that the militia he sent to this area sometimes behaved as bad as or worse than the men they were hunting. He had been told that one especially brutal militia group had gone from house to house, night after night, forcing their way in at gunpoint, and then gang-raped the wives and daughters. The Randolph County area sure enough was having its own inner civil war. Right after the South lost at Gettysburg, droves of new and bitter deserters started showing up here. Some say there were at least 1,100 outliers, armed and organized, around the Randolph-Moore-Chatham border by September of 1863. Owens and his followers got so bold they were conducting hit-and-run raids against jails where conscription resistors were held. They'd shoot it out with the guards and free the prisoners, who would then join up with Owens. Long about that time, General Robert Hoke's brigade was sent to the Piedmont to establish order from Wilkes and Yadkin counties all the way to the eastern borders of Chatham and Moore. Of course, the outliers weren't dumb enough to take on Hoke's columns, but there were plenty of sharp little skirmishes, mostly between Confederate patrols and bushwhackers. Hoke's men acted disciplined like soldiers and behaved themselves, but the home guard units that were called out to help them didn't. No, sir. They used the protection of the close-by Confederate units as an excuse to settle a lot of old scores that they couldn't have settled alone. Therefore, a lot more fields were burned and a lot more families were traumatized. Some of the local men got to be noted for their talents as so-called manhunters. Adam Brewer and Peter Garner were notorious. Brewer had been robbed a number of times by the outliers and seems to have been driven more by a desire for personal revenge than by political convictions. A man who was there is quoted as saying, "This man Brewer does not belong to the service. This is just a voluntary act to hunt down his neighbors and kill them." Brewer was bad, but Peter Garner was the most feared. He's described as a brute of a man because he hunted down every possible recruit he got to be called the Hunter. He was hated by everybody but detested and feared by the women of the community. He wore a big gun and knife on his belt, hung a rope under his coat. He was so brazen that he walked right in without knocking and used the same language to men and women alike. Garner and Brewer sometimes teamed up to lead Confederate troops into the hills, and sometimes they commanded their own small forces. One time they lured a crippled Union sympathizer named McDonald into the woods and enjoyed seeing how many times they could shoot him without actually killing him. Judging from the number of bullet holes in the corpse and the footprints around him, the men that buried him figured he had been a long time dying. In late 1864, Garner and his men rounded up 22 teenage boys, including 15-year-old Yancey Cox, tied them up like slaves, and bullwhipped them all the way to the impressment agency in Asheboro. Then the boys were forced to march almost 250 miles to Wilmington, where they were locked up in a warehouse full of sick and dying men. Yancey come up with an escape plan right away. He slammed himself against the front door a couple of times without doing any good, but then, quoting Yancey, "I must have prayed for the first time in my life where I felt a surge of strength come into my body which only God Almighty could have given me, and this time I ran clear through that door. Both guards jumped me as I went through, and in the fight one of them stuck a bayonet clear through my right thigh. But by now the recruits were pouring out over us, and within 3 minutes the warehouse was empty." They all ran to the side of a hill and hid there till about 2 o'clock that morning. Then, under cover of darkness, they ran for some bushes at the bottom of the hill and kept running for about 2 hours. Some shots were fired, but nobody was hit. They took bearings from the stars and bedded down until daylight. From there they traveled mostly at night. They lived on nuts and berries and whatever they could forage on the way home. One time they managed to catch an opossum close to a haystack at the edge of a meadow. Because it was snowing hard, they were afraid of leaving tracks, so they slept in the haystack for 2 days, eating persimmons and chewing raw possum. Yancey's account of the adventure reads, quote, "It was difficult to parcel out 22 pieces of raw possum, and some of the boys grumbled at their small share, but not for long, for the longer they chewed it, the bigger it got." During the whole journey back, they had talked about how they were going to cross Deep River. When they finally got there, it had been raining hard, and the river was way up over its banks, almost a half a mile across. Down around Franklinville, a couple of miles past a covered bridge, Yancey saw a 3-log raft tied up on the opposite side of the river. Now, he knew if he could get across the guarded bridge, he could steal that raft and pick up his buddies. Long about dark, they saw a farmer and an ox-drawn wagon getting ready to cross the bridge. Yancey eased out of the woods, got under the wagon without the farmer knowing, and hung underneath all the way across the bridge without the guards at either end seeing him. Finally, on the other side, he got to the raft and cut it loose and maneuvered it across the river to the others. They all piled on and almost made it across before the raft come apart in the current and dumped all 22 of them in the cold water. Now, cold water can be a great motivator, and they all managed to grab tree limbs and climb out on the home side of the river where they could hide in the virgin woodlands between Deep River and Richland Creek. Of course, they knew they couldn't just waltz back home without the hunter finding them, so they decided to live like the outliers till the trouble was past and they could go home again. Yancey sneaked home once or twice to see his mother, Eunice Cox, and for a long time after she hid food and clothes and things he'd need in secret places for him, like along the picket fences around her property. Naturally, almost every day somebody would search the house or barn or just meddle around while Eunice and the girls went about their work. Then, one night, the hunter crashed in without knocking, searched the house, tore up the cellar boards, cussing and railing at her for, quote, defending a worthless son like Yancey, 15 years old and able to tote a gun. They say that Eunice turned on him when he told her that and said, "I freed my slaves of my own free will 27 years ago, and if my son could get to the Union Army, he'd help to free the rest of them. But he's not going to fight to keep humans in bondage. Now get out of my house and stay out," she said. And with that, she grabbed the gun over the mantel and fired a shot that splintered the fence rail as he ran off. Yancey and the boys had to kill him after that. 3 of them loaded their muskets with double charges, and 2 of the 3 unloaded them into the hunter one morning while he was tending his fish traps on a little stream that empties into Deep River. He died laying in the middle of the creek, and they cut the brass buttons off his coat for souvenirs. The hunter died like a lot of his victims had. His sometimes partner, Adam Brewer, though, appears to have been lucky. As far as we know, he made it through the war. When General Hoke's brigade was in the area, naturally, Unionist activity dropped off, and naturally, as soon as he left in February of 1864, the outliers come out of hiding and the violence started back up just like he had never been there. The most active band was still led by William Owens, who had survived some narrow escapes of his own. But Owens' luck ran out in April. A group of militia officers led by Colonel Alfred Pike found out where Owens and his men were camped. Well, found out is not quite accurate. Actually, they hung Owens' wife up by her thumbs, and when that didn't loosen her tongue, they dragged her, and then Pike and one of his men crushed her fingers between two fence rails. All of this with her 12-month-old baby laying on the ground just a few feet away. The next day, a posse headed by the Randolph County Sheriff surprised Owens' camp and captured him. Owens had been wounded pretty badly in a gunfight a few days earlier and was almost helpless to defend himself, so they took him without too much of a fight. Never brought him to trial successfully, though. You see, some of Owens' men were still at large, and word had gone out that anybody dumb enough to speak against him was as good as dead. The men and women who could have testified for the prosecution were afraid to open their mouths. Because the authorities had every reason to believe that the outliers would break Owens out of jail, they decided to move him to a safer location, the pro-Confederate village of Pittsboro. They threw him in the Pittsboro jail to rot, and he stayed there till the final weeks of the war, when a mob broke into his cell, dragged him out on the street, and lynched him. As you might expect, the election of 1864 did nothing but turn up the heat on the Randolph County front. Governor Vance sent Home Guard detachments to secure the polling places in Randolph and Moore, Montgomery, and Chatham counties, and Election Day was peaceful. The trouble came when the votes were published. Well, of course, the outlier bands had supported the peace candidate, a man named William Holden, but when Holden was skunked at the ballot box, a bunch of deserters ambushed a squad of poll guards near Carthage and killed 3 of them. Another ambush close to Franklinville a few days later killed 4 militiamen, graybeards from the senior reserves. When Governor Vance heard about this new level of violence, he mobilized no fewer than 11 Home Guard battalions under command of General Colette Leaventhorpe. His units got to the outliers through their families. Wives, children, parents, and grandparents of the Unionists were rounded up and stuck in makeshift prisons where they were fed nothing but bread and water till they told where the deserters were or till the deserters themselves came in. A militia soldier wrote a letter from Asheboro on August 29, 1864 about it. He said, "We are taking the fathers of the deserters to the camp and treat them as prisoners till they send for their sons to replace them. We're taking property, too. We bring women to the camp that has their husbands in the woods till they send for 'em and bring 'em in. That's the best way to catch 'em." A Confederate soldier named Welborn, a man who was in favor of rounding up deserters, wrote this after seeing a 76-year-old father of a known deserter beaten. He said, quote, "We can do without such measures. Surely God will not smile on such doings." Leaventhorpe rounded up some 300 deserters with these tactics, but it didn't change anything. When his force was disbanded, things immediately went back to the way they were before. By the spring of 1865, a lot of the pro-Confederate families had given up and moved away from the trouble. The militant Unionists and armed deserters roamed almost at will, stealing whatever they wanted, terrorizing old enemies, real and imagined, and lighting the night sky with burning houses and barns. Even though Robert E. Lee was desperate for men, he sent 600 troops to the Randolph County area in March of 1865 to protect the rail line and supply depots around Greensboro. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Carey McAllister, commander of the 46th Regiment of North Carolina troops, led that mission. McAllister was a native of Asheboro and son-in-law of J.M. Worth. While McAllister's men were hunting the deserters, parts of Sherman's cavalry were burning and looting the lower part of the 7th Congressional District. On March 7, 1865, the Confederate cavalry under Generals Hampton and Wheeler fought Union foragers near Rockingham, only about 60 miles below Asheboro. On the 11th, Sherman occupied Fayetteville, and on the 12th, a detachment of Federal troops are said to have been in Carthage, the seat of Moore County. There, in the closing weeks of the war, the citizens of the Randolph County area found themselves between a rock and a hard place. They couldn't win, no matter where their sympathies lay. The pro-Confederates were robbed and harassed by deserters and were deathly afraid of Sherman's army. The pro-Unionists found themselves facing hundreds more troops who had been sent here to reinforce General Johnston's forces and were in constant dread of being killed or captured. Thankfully, the war ended with Johnston's surrender to Sherman at Durham Station on April 26, 1865. After 2.5 years of being hunted like wild animals, the outliers could abandon their caves and hideouts and go back home to at least a semi-normal existence. Likewise, the pro-Confederate citizens could find some joy in having the terror lifted that they had lived under for so long. Generally speaking, though, it's hard to imagine how hard the conditions were then. The economy was in shambles, and the social, political, and spiritual systems had been ripped apart. It is said that in Randolph County only 5 men in 20 came back from the war at all, and that only 1 in 20 came back whole. Because there was no organization or mass communication or transportation after the war, the Confederate soldiers were left to get home as best they could. Most of them walked, begging for food along the way. The older people were in many ways the hardest hit. Plenty of them had lost everything, including their sons. The hope was to be found in the young, and the story of Yancey Cox, that 15-year-old who escaped the warehouse in Wilmington, and Nancy Loudermilk is a pretty good illustration. When the war broke out, Nancy Loudermilk was only 11 years old, and within 10 days of the bombardment of Fort Sumter, her father was sent to Charleston for duty in the salt works. He, like thousands of others, left his family on the farm. Within 3 months, his wife died of smallpox, and Nancy had to raise her 5 little brothers and sisters all alone during 4 years of war. After the war, though, Nancy became something of a heroine in the area because of her courage in taking care of the family all alone, and Yancey was, of course, a hero for his exploits. One day, they held a celebration honoring Nancy, and Yancey happened to be there. They met and fell in love, and in March of 1869 got married. Because they were both legendary in the area, the wedding was quite an event. It is said that the wedding was, quote, the largest and grandest gathering of its kind in the history of Randolph County. Meanwhile, on the political front, the militant Unionists in the central county started holding public meetings at which they, quote, assembled after years of oppression and tyranny to enjoy once more the sacred right of freedom of speech. They passed resolutions and cheered at the reestablishment of the United States rule in the Tar Heel State. One of the more unusual resolutions was in support of the deserters. It announced that, quote, we recognize in all men who fled from their homes and families rather than stain their hands in brothers' blood and fight against their government the principle of true patriotism and cordially invite them to return to their homes, end quote. In fact, though, the inner Civil War wasn't nearly over. There was plenty of wartime grudges settled with violence, and on top of the hundreds of outright casualties, there was a terrible economic, emotional, and spiritual toll almost beyond imagining. You know, the Bible says that the sins of the fathers will be visited on their children for 7 generations. If that's true, and it just might be, we got a long ways to go before the inner Civil War is truly over. But that, as they say, is another story.
The years creep slowly by, Lorena. The snow is on the grass again. The sun's low down the sky, Lorena. The frost gleams where the flowers have as when the summer days were nigh. The sun can never dip so low adown the affection's cloudless sky. The sun can never dip so low adown the affection's cloudless sky. Flowery May, when up the hilly slope we climb to watch the dying of the day and hear the distant church bells chime, to watch the dying of the day and hear the distant church bells chime. It matters little now, Lorena, the past is in the eternal past. Our heads will soon lie low, Lorena, life's tide is ebbing out so fast. Of life, this is so small a part. 'Tis dust to dust beneath the sun, but there, up there is heart to heart.